All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the story of India's very first great empire. But here's the thing, this isn't your typical history lesson. It's more like a detective story, pieced together from whispers, competing stories, and a whole lot of contradictions. So, let's set the scene. Imagine the Indian subcontinent around 600 BCE. It's not one unified place. It's a vibrant, chaotic patchwork of 16 powerful kingdoms, these Mahajanapadas. The big question is, how on earth did one of them, just one region called Magadha, rise up from the pack to dominate everyone and build the legendary Mauryan Empire?
Okay, before we get into how they did it, we gotta ask, what even is an empire? What makes it different from just a big, successful kingdom? Because believe me, it's about way more than just having a lot of land.
Well, historians usually look for four key things. See, the other kingdoms had the basics down, a king, a priest, a general, but the Mauryans, they were playing a totally different game. We're talking about a sophisticated, multi-layered state administration. We're talking about uniform laws for everyone, monumental architecture that screamed, "We're here to stay," and a single script to send orders from one end of the subcontinent to the other. They weren't just bigger, they were smarter.
And if you look at Magadha on a map, it's almost like it was destined for this. I mean, talk about a perfect launchpad. It was practically a natural fortress surrounded by 3 rivers. The land, incredibly fertile, which meant a huge tax base to fund their ambitions. Plus, they had the Chotanagpur Plateau right next door, loaded with minerals and, get this, elephants, the tanks of the ancient world. And to top it all off, they controlled the major trade highways. They had the money, the resources, and the defenses. It was the perfect storm. Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting, because almost everything we think we know about the Mauryans comes from sources that are, well, let's just say they don't exactly agree with each other. This isn't just reading a history book. It's a full-on investigation. Just look at the founder of the whole empire, Chandragupta Maurya. Who was this guy? Well, it depends on who you ask. Jain texts say he was a kshatriya, a royal warrior. The Puranas, they claim he was from a lower caste, a shudra. Buddhist texts say he was upper caste. A famous play written later says he was low-born. I mean, come on, they can't even agree on where he came from. So what gives? The reason for all this confusion is that these ancient sources had different jobs. Some of them are what we call prescriptive. Think of them like a manual or a rule book. They're describing how things should be, the ideal situation. And then you have descriptive texts, which are trying to tell you what actually happened, warts and all. Here's the perfect example. The famous Arthashastra, often called the ultimate guide to statecraft, is prescriptive. It lays out the perfect kingdom, what a king should do. It's an ideal. But then you look at the edicts carved into stone by Emperor Ashoka. Those are descriptive. It's the king himself saying, "I have commanded this." One is the theory, the other is the reality. And you'd think, okay, I'll just trust an eyewitness, right? Wrong. Take the Greek ambassador Megasthenes. This guy literally lived in the Mauryan capital. He wrote a whole book about it, and in it he says, get this, that there was no slavery in India. Meanwhile, Indian texts, like the Arthashastra, have entire chapters dedicated to the rules around slaves. So even a guy on the ground can get it completely, fundamentally wrong. All right, let's talk about the rulers themselves, because this is where the stories get really, really biased, depending on who's doing the talking. If you read the Buddhist chronicles, Emperor Ashoka starts out as an absolute villain. Seriously, they call him Chanda Ashoka, which means Ashoka the Fierce. And the story goes that he killed 99 of his own brothers just to get the throne. I mean, that is a dark, brutal origin story. But you have to ask yourself, why would they paint him that way? Well, there's a pretty clear agenda. It's the ultimate before and after story. If you make him out to be this terrible, bloodthirsty tyrant before he discovered Buddhism, then his transformation into a compassionate ruler seems way more incredible, right? It makes Buddhism look like the most powerful, life-changing force in the universe. He becomes their star pupil. What we do know for sure, though, is that this dynasty was incredibly diverse in its beliefs. The founder, Chandragupta, ended up converting to Jainism. His son, Bindusara, was a follower of the Ajivaka sect, and then his grandson, Ashoka, famously embraced Buddhism. 3 generations, 3 different major philosophies. That kind of religious tolerance and personal choice at the highest level of power is just fascinating for the ancient world. So if all of the written stories are biased, how can we possibly know how this giant empire actually functioned? Well, we have to turn away from the texts for a minute and look at the hard evidence, the stuff they literally carved in stone. I'm talking about the pillars of Ashoka, and these things are just mind-boggling from a logistical standpoint. Think about it. They're monolithic, meaning each one is carved from a single giant piece of sandstone. They were all quarried and polished in one spot, a place called Chunar, and then shipped somehow thousands of kilometers across the subcontinent. That tells you everything about their level of organization. It points to a centralized, almost industrial-scale operation. Now, for a long time, people claimed they must have been influenced by the Greeks. But when you actually look at them, that theory falls apart. Greek pillars were made in sections, stacked on top of each other, and they were structural. They held up roofs. Mauryan pillars are single, massive pieces of stone that stand all by themselves. They weren't holding anything up. They were broadcasting the emperor's power and his message. This was a homegrown, purely Indian innovation. This brings us to a really key idea. The Mauryan Empire wasn't a single, unified block where every corner was ruled the same way. No way. Historians now believe it was a tiered system. You had the metropolitan center, around the capital, which was under direct, tight control. Then you had the core areas, managed by administrators. And finally, you had the periphery, the borderlands, where imperial control was much, much looser. And you don't have to take my word for it. Ashoka says so himself. In one of his edicts, right after he talks about giving up war and embracing compassion, he adds this really stark warning to the forest dwellers out on the edges of his empire. He basically says, look, I've changed my ways, but don't test me. I still have the power to crush you if I have to. It's a fascinating glimpse into the limits of his power. You can even see this tiered system in their tax policy. We know this because a pillar at Lumbini, the birthplace of the Buddha, explicitly states that Ashoka visited and lowered the tax rate there to just 1/8. That's a huge tax break. It shows that it wasn't a one-size-fits-all system. Your taxes depended on who you were and where you lived.
So, let's bring it all together. After sorting through all the biased texts and the stone-cold facts, what are we left with? What is the real legacy here?
Well, in total, the empire stood for about 140 years. After Ashoka died, things started to unravel, and the end was dramatic. In 187 BCE, the last Mauryan king, Brihadratha, was assassinated. And who did it? His own top general, right in the middle of a military review. That's about as clear a sign as you can get that the central power holding everything together had just evaporated.
So, in the end, the Mauryan Empire that we study today isn't just one thing. It's really a story built from two different sets of materials. It was built once with armies, administration, and massive stone pillars. And it was built a second time, after the fact, with stories, legends, and a whole lot of political spin. And that leaves us with one big, lingering question. The story of the Mauryans is a perfect case study for a problem that haunts all of history. When we look back, are we actually learning what happened? Or are we just hearing the version of the story that was told by the winners? Or maybe just by the best storytellers?